So there's a very odd precept that pervades a lot of political discourse that is about the question of how important is it that if you're somebody who claims to be devoted to a political cause or are advocating that others adhere to certain political values, that you yourself have your life align with those political values. And the converse is also equally important, which is if you're somebody who goes around condemning other people for failing to support certain causes that you claim are important, and yet your life is in contradiction to those causes, do you have any credibility to actually persuade others to your cause? I've been wondering about this for a long time. I've been noticing for a long time that this is kind of lurking in a lot of political discourse, I would say particularly in left liberal politics, where there are explicit views and precepts that have been disseminated to relieve people of the responsibility to have their life align with their political values. There's all sorts of arguments that have been concocted to excuse people from having a life completely at odds with the politics they say they believe. But I wanted to talk about that in light of some new research, psychological research, that is very much about this question, and that has found that those people who live a life at odds with their political values have no credibility to convince others that their political cause is just and that they are genuinely devoted to it. So it was first mentioned in this article, in this op-ed in the New York Times just a couple of weeks ago on April 10th by Joe Fassler. And it was about the fact that there are a lot of extremely wealthy people, namely billionaires, who go around the world insisting that the greatest problem the world faces is the climate crisis. And yet as they do that, they engage in extremely gluttonous consumption, particularly things like having a mega yacht that leaves a huge carbon footprint. In fact, some of these yachts create more carbon output than all kinds of automobiles combined. And the research suggests that if you're somebody who does that, you're going to have a very hard time convincing people that you believe that the climate crisis is a grave threat while you're constructing mega yachts that are the size of large apartment buildings. So first, let's take a look at the research that was presented in this op-ed. There you see the headline, "The super yachts of billionaires are starting to look a lot like theft," and the article reads, quote, "On an individual basis, the super rich pollute far more than the rest of us, and travel is one of the biggest parts of the footprint. Take, for instance, Rising Sun, the 454-foot, 82-room megaship owned by the DreamWorks co-founder David Geffen. According to a 2021 analysis in the journal Sustainability, the diesel fuel powering Mr. Geffen's boating habit spews an estimated 16,320 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent gases into the atmosphere annually, almost 800 times what the average American generates in a year. And that's just a single ship. Worldwide, more than 5,500 private vessels clock in about 100 feet or longer, the size at which a yacht becomes a super yacht. This fleet pollutes as much as entire nations. The 300 biggest boats alone emit 315,000 tons of carbon dioxide each year based on their likely usage, about as much as Burundi's more than 10 million inhabitants. Indeed, a 200-foot vessel burns 132 gallons of diesel fuel an hour standing still and can guzzle 2,200 gallons just to travel 100 nautical miles. You're probably thinking, and this is the argument constantly offered in left liberal politics when people bring up the gap between a person's private conduct on the one hand and the political values they publicly and flamboyantly claim to represent. You're probably thinking, quote, "But isn't that a drop in the bucket compared to the thousands of coal plants around the world spewing carbon?" It's a common sentiment. Last year, Christopher Béchu, France's Minister of the Environment, dismissed calls to regulate charter flights as, quote, "the buzz," flashy, populist solutions that get people amped up, but ultimately only fiddle at the margins of climate change. But this misses a much more important point. Research in economics and psychology suggest humans are willing to behave altruistically, but only when they believe everyone is being asked to contribute. people, quote, stop cooperating when they see that some are not doing their part, as the cognitive scientists Nicolas Beaumont and Coralie Chavalet wrote last year in Le Monde. In that sense, super polluting yachts and jets don't just worsen climate change, they lessen the chance that we will work together to fix it. Why bother when the luxury goods mogul Bernard Arnault is cruising around on the Symphony, a $150 million 330-foot super yacht? Last June, at Celebs Jets, a Twitter account that tracked the flights of well-known figures using public data, then calculated their carbon emissions for all to see, revealed that the influencer Kylie Jenner took a 17-minute flight between two regional airports in California. Quote, Kylie Jenner is out here taking 3-minute flights with her private jet, but I'm the one who has to use paper straws, one Twitter user wrote. As media outlets around the world covered the backlash, other celebrities like Drake and Taylor Swift scrambled to defend their heavy reliance on private planes. Now, it isn't just and here I think we have the tweet that mentioned, that article mentioned, or maybe not, but it was the one that said, so Kylie Jenner is out there taking 3-minute flights on her private jet, and I have to use paper straws. Now, this gap between a lot of left liberal discourse condemning other people for all sorts of political crimes on the one hand, and the people who are doing that condemnation living lives completely at odds with those political values, refusing to sacrifice in any way for the cause they claim is so overarching, is very common. And that's the reason why I want to explore it, because there's a whole set of excuses that have been disseminated and accepted in liberal culture about why, as an individual, you never have to make any sacrifices for your political cause, why you never have to ensure that your own action aligns with the political values you want to impose on everybody else. Now, perhaps the most glaring example is the current climate czar, John Kerry, whose job is to go around the world convincing everybody that the climate crisis is the most pressing problem. It's an existential threat to all of us, and we have to radically transform our society and begin to engage in real sacrifice in order to solve it. The problem is that John Kerry goes around the world saying this, constantly using private jets. As many of you remember who lived through the 2004 election when John Kerry was the presidential nominee, he married his colleague's widow, Teresa Heinz, who is the heir to a gigantic fortune, so he lives in extreme wealth, John Kerry does. He's a billionaire, or his wife is, many times over. And so he flies around the world the way billionaires do on private jets, which, as that article just demonstrated, creates a bigger footprint of carbon than even entire countries. And so he was asked about that. How is it that you can, with credibility, claim that other nations have to radically transform their behavior while you can't even make the small sacrifice of flying a commercial jet when you go around the world to lecture everybody? He's asked that twice. Here is one of the instances in which he tried to answer that.
It's the only choice for somebody like me. The time it takes me to get somewhere, I can't sail across the ocean. I have to fly to meet with people and get things done. But what I'm doing almost full time is working to win the battle of climate change. I'm not going to be put on the defense.
He's not going to be put on the defensive. The reason he takes private jets is because someone like him has to. There's just no other choice. There was a second interview he gave in which he was confronted about what this interview was referring to as climate hypocrisy, and here's what he said.
Private aviation is an example of something where people are starting to pay more attention, and but when people who go to Davos to talk about climate change fly private, it seems like they don't want to make.
Well, they actually, I've talked to them about it. They offset. They buy offsets, they offset, and they are working harder than most people I know to be able to try to affect this transition.
So the people who fly to Davos to talk about the climate crisis and fly in private jets, they're the people who are actually doing the most to solve the climate crisis because they use their vast wealth to buy offsets to the carbon footprint. But if the climate crisis is really the grave and existential threat that these people insist that it is, why wouldn't they do both? Why wouldn't they take the very small sacrifice, not actually that hard? I don't know, I've spent my entire life flying to multiple places. I've never once been on a private jet. I've never really regarded that as a hardship. I don't think it's a big sacrifice to have to fly on a commercial plane on a schedule along with everybody else. And yet John Kerry is saying, no, it's totally fine that that's what they do. You shouldn't in any way doubt their sincerity when they impose demands on everybody else and condemn everybody else for not doing enough. John Kerry said the people who fly to Davos on private jets are the people who are doing the most for climate change because they're using their wealth to buy carbon offsets. So they're even better than you as they fly to Davos on private jets. So obviously, if you're somebody like John Kerry or all of these, David Geffen, or all of these people who keep telling you that you have to transform society, they may even be right. But as that article in the New York Times suggested, and as studies show, and it's not hard to understand, if you see somebody whose life is a complete violation of what they want everybody else to do for a cause, because they're unwilling to sacrifice in their life for that cause, you're going to have a very hard time believing them when they tell you that you should sacrifice in your life in pursuit of this cause, or that that cause is even important. They lose all credibility as a moral messenger or as a messenger at all. Now, there are a couple other examples. Let's look at the former Secretary of Labor under Bill Clinton, who has become one of the most, we're going to get that up here in just a second, one of the most vocal advocates of the idea that climate change is the most important cause, but he's also somebody who is very angry about the fact that there is a problem with wealth inequality and poverty and homelessness in the United States, and that's Robert Reich. Let's get this article up about what Robert Reich did when it came time to try and solve the homeless problem in San Francisco. There you see it on the screen, left-wing University of Berkeley professor doesn't want the poor people moving into his posh neighborhood. It's an article from August of 2020. Quote, Robert Reich, a left-wing professor at the University of California, Berkeley, who served as labor secretary during the Clinton administration, is very concerned about income inequality. He urged Wall Street executives to, quote, invest in cities by funding low-income housing projects. He also praised a, quote, promising initiative to promote the construction of affordable housing units in San Francisco. Reich is not so keen, however, on a proposal to tear down a dilapidated building in his Berkeley neighborhood and replace it with a 10-unit development that would include low-income housing. Reich and some of his wealthy neighbors are imploring the city's Landmarks Preservation Commission to designate the dilapidated structure, known as the Payson House, as a Berkeley landmark in order to stop the proposed development. In a letter to the commission, Reich said the proposed housing units would destroy the, quote, charm of an older era of Berkeley, and liken the developers' actions to, quote, the illegal practices and corrupt politics of the late 19th century. Quote, if historic preservation means anything, it means maintaining enough of the character of an older neighborhood to remind people of its history and provide continuity with the present, Reich wrote. Development for the sake of development makes no sense when it imposes social costs like this. It is one of the more striking examples of the rich white liberals, particularly in the state of California, whose expressed concern for affordable housing, income inequality, and social justice disappears the minute their own property values and exclusive neighborhoods are targeted for corrective action. So can anyone deny that Robert Reich's ability to convince people of the sincerity of his beliefs, that wealth inequality is wrong, that homelessness is wrong, is sincere when it comes time for his own neighborhood? He blocks the development of low-income housing that would enable people who are living on the street, who are homeless, to be able to have houses. It seems like he gets a lot of pleasure and a lot of satisfaction from condemning other people, from being capitalists, and yet when it comes time to it for his own life, he enjoys the exclusivity of his own neighborhood and would rather have that preserved than open it up for poor people. Now, let me show you a counterexample or two of how people might try and be consistent. The current mayor of New York is Eric Adams. He is somebody who stridently views climate change as one of the greatest problems that the world faces, and as a result, he has looked at studies, which we're about to show you, that says that one of the worst problems for the climate crisis, one of the biggest impediments to solving global warming is the factory farm industry, and particularly the consumption of meat, because the more meat the people consume, the more trees are cut down to make way for them, the more greenhouse gases are emitted from meat, and therefore it would stand to reason, if you actually are somebody who believes in the fact that climate change is this impending doom for the world and everybody has to radically transform, you would want to do something about this problem. Namely, you would want to stop eating meat, if that's something that you really believed. Here's The Guardian with that evidence. You see it on the screen. Quote, meat accounts for nearly 60% of all greenhouse gases from food production, study finds. Production of meat worldwide causes twice the pollution of production of plant-based foods, a major new study has found. The article says, quote, the global production of food is responsible for a third of all planet-heating gases emitted by human activity, with the use of animals for meat causing twice the pollution of producing plant-based foods, a major new study has found. The entire system of food production, such as the use of farming machinery, spraying of fertilizer, and transportation of products, causes 17.3 billion metric tons of greenhouse gases a year, according to the research. This enormous release of gases that fuel the climate crisis is more than double the entire emissions of the U.S. and represents 35% of all global emissions, researchers said. Quote, the emissions are at the higher end of what we expected. It was a little bit of a surprise, said Adel Jain, a climate scientist at the University of Illinois and co-author of the paper published in Nature Foods. Quote, this study shows the entire cycle of the food production system, and policymakers may want to use the results to think about how to control greenhouse gases. Now, looking at that study, the current mayor of New York, Eric Adams, who, as I said, is a very vocal proponent of the idea that climate change is one of our worst crises, decided that it doesn't make sense to simultaneously claim that while refusing to sacrifice in some way, including by not eating meat any longer. So today he made an announcement, and we have the video here. Let's bring it up, that the city would implement policies to reduce the amount of meat consumption and replace it instead with a plant-based diet. Here's what he said.
1 in every 5 metric tons of carbon dioxide our city emits comes from food. But all food is not created equal. The vast majority of food that is contributing to our emission crisis lies in meat and dairy products. We already know that a plant power diet is better for your physical and mental health, and I am living proof of that. But the reality is that thanks to this new inventory, we're finding out it is better for the planet.
Now, as I said, the vast majority of people who are on the left, who are liberals, who say that the climate crisis is the greatest #1 threat the world faces, that we have to radically transform our society and sacrifice in all sorts of ways, are meat eaters. They continue to consume meat. And if you confront them about this obvious inconsistency between, on the one hand, claiming that the crisis of climate change is the greatest one we face, and on the other, refusing to take even minimal sacrifices in their own diet to cease consuming meat, which, as the Guardian article demonstrated, is one of the greatest fuels of the climate crisis, they have a whole variety of excuses, beginning with the argument, it's incredibly convenient, that says there's no value in my making individual sacrifices. Just like those yacht owners say, just like the French minister said when people urged him to regulate mega yachts. He said, oh, those are just things on the margin. They'll say individual action doesn't matter, collective action is the only thing that counts. Imagine how lucky you are to be part of a political faction that tells you that you never have to make any changes to your personal behavior in pursuit of your political cause, because individual action, the things you decide to do, the values reflected by your life, actually don't matter at all. You can violate every single political value you want others to accept, and then tell yourself it makes no difference. You're free to do that because only collective action matter, and your own actions that you take as an individual are completely irrelevant. It really is this amazing component of left liberal politics that when deciding how to judge people's character, or deciding how to judge someone's values, they've managed to take the thing that should be the most important in judging other people, namely the actions they actually take in their lives, how people choose to live their lives, what values those choices reflect, and they've announced that that's the thing that matters least. That what matters in judging people is what hashtags you post to your social media account, what slogans you chant when others are watching, what political party you support. Those are all the things that determine whether you're a good or bad person, but how you live your life is totally irrelevant. Even to the point where they have a universally accepted view that if they accuse somebody of being a racist or white supremacist, and the person responds by saying, what do you mean? I have great relationships with people who are non-white in my life. I have best friends who are black. I have some of my most important and closest relationships that are Latino or Arab or whatever. They scoff at that. They laugh at that as though that's completely irrelevant. The way in which you live your life, the people with whom you choose to create friendships. Instead, all that matters is whether you're posting the right hashtags and whether you're voting for the right political party. They really have made it so that personal actions, personal behavior, personal choices, which should be the most important thing in judging other people, has become the thing that they value the least. So let's take a look at one of the more popular figures on the, let's call it the mainstream left, the Bernie AOC left, the people who call themselves leftists, but at the end of the day always pledge their support to the Democratic Party to stay on the right side of mainstream lines. That's why it's called the Bernie AOC left, because Bernie Sanders and AOC do that same thing. His name is Hasan Piker. He is a very popular person on Twitch, which is the Amazon-owned streaming and gaming site. He first came to prominence, if you can call it that, because he's the nephew of Cenk Uygur, the host of The Young Turks. He's Cenk's nephew. But he's now built a large audience that listens to him talk about left-wing politics. And I put that in scare quotes because at the end of the day, it's really just a way of herding people into the Democratic Party. And he has become extremely rich by virtue of his popularity on Twitch. And not only extremely rich, but he lives a life of gluttonous capitalistic consumption. At the same time that he constantly condemns other people for being capitalists, he claims to be a socialist. And the question, of course, is whether there's an inconsistency between the way in which he lives his life through extreme amounts of luxurious material wealth on the one hand, and his demands that society become more socialistic on the other. Just like John Kerry flies to conferences to yell at everybody about climate change, but then flies on a private jet, or the people who Davos Doe or Robert Reich doing the same thing. It's exactly the same thing. So let's look first at his at this inconsistency that seems to be pretty evident. Here you see the headline from April of last year from Insider. The headline there is, leftist political commentator Hasan Piker faces criticism for buying a nearly $3 million home in Los Angeles County. Now, obviously, the criticism isn't that he bought a home. Everybody needs a home. Everybody needs a place to live. You shouldn't be expected to have to live on the street. The question is, if somebody is so wealthy and uses their wealth for this kind of extreme materialistic consumption while insisting that wealth inequality is immoral, that we should restructure fundamentally our society and everybody else should give up the kind of inequality he has in his life, whether there's some inconsistency in that way. So let's look at the article first. It says, Hasan Piker, one of Twitch's leading political commentators, is facing a wave of criticism after purchasing a home in West Hollywood, as followers accuse the self-described, quote, leftist of being hypocritical. The 3,800 square foot home with 5 bedrooms and 5.5 bathrooms. This is a single person in his late 20s or 30s with no wife, no children. He has a 5-bedroom, 5.5 bathroom located in the Beverly Grove neighborhood. Cost $2.74 million, according to the real estate news website Dirt. Now, he has invoked all of the standard arguments that people in left liberal culture use, why you should ignore the way in which they're living their lives, the choices that they're making, the values reflected by those choices, and instead only focus on systemic questions and not hold them accountable or find it odd that the way in which they're choosing their lives seems to be contrary to the values they want to impose on everybody else. So here's, by the way, a couple of pictures of his home. There's the interior, very, very spacious and very nice. Here's an outdoor shot of the home from the real estate listing. Now, he has a whole variety of excuses that, again, come from the way in which the left has insisted that personal conduct doesn't matter. Here, let's just look at a couple of tweets. Here he is sarcastically complaining, quote, "Socialism is when you live in a shed built by hand off the grid." So in other words, he's saying, people are attacking me for living in a house. I'm supposed to live in a shed. No one's suggesting that. It's just there's a big difference between living in a house and buying a multi-million-dollar mansion in Los Angeles with 5 bathrooms and 5.5 bedrooms while you claim to be a socialist. Here's another complaint in his video crying about my house and income. Ben Shapiro said, quote, "Is a worker not entitled to the fruits of his labor?" as a talking point in support of capitalism. In the most reductive terms, that is literally the core of socialism. And then here he is again attacking what he calls left Twitter weirdos for noting this inconsistency, saying they and Breitbart are on the same page, that socialism means you have no house. So this is the set of arguments that they have as to why you should ignore personal behavior. There's a comic, I think we have this, that has become very popular in left-wing politics. If we don't have that, we can put that up. It's essentially a comic mocking the idea, here it is, it's a cartoon here, that anyone whose life wildly contradicts the political values they claim to believe in might have a difficult time acting with credibility. Here you see that the critique reduced to someone saying we should improve society somewhat, and then the person that you're supposed to mock saying, yet you participate in society. Curious, I am very intelligent. So this is what John Kerry would point to if you criticized him for flying in private jets to Davos to talk about the climate crisis, or it's what Robert Reich would point to, oh, all I'm doing is participating in society. That doesn't mean I'm precluded from arguing society should be better and should be changed. That's what David Geffen would say. Yes, I have a mega yacht. I'm just participating in the system. It doesn't mean that I can't argue that society should be different and that we should solve the climate crisis collectively. This is the argument they have built in to their politics. Now, so extreme is this refusal to accept any personal responsibility that they'll go around, oftentimes, the people who have these inconsistencies, criticizing other people for pursuing lives of material wealth. So I want to show you a couple videos that Hasan Piker recently posted, in which he talked about both myself and Matt Taibbi and claimed that the reason Matt Taibbi and I have changed our politics, which is his view, is because we're the ones who are seeking material wealth. Let me show you a couple of these videos that he just recently posted within the last week.
I don't care. I like his defense of.
This is, by the way, Hasan Piker on his very popular Twitch show that earns him millions of dollars a month, responding to a conversation between the former New York Times reporter Chris Hedges, who left the paper because he was objecting to their support for the Iraq War, talking to Brianna Joy Gray. And Chris Hedges had defended myself, Matt Taibbi, Jimmy Dore, claiming that we haven't changed our political views at all, that instead the Democratic Party, people like Hasan Piker and others on the left, have become tools of the establishment. And since we continue to oppose establishment doctrine, they see us as being on the other side and think we've switched sides, whereas in reality, they're the ones who have done so to stay on the right side of the mainstream line. He's responding to that critique, and here's what he said.
Of Glenn Greenwald, who makes like literally, I think, $250,000 a month, or no, more than that actually. Glenn Greenwald's Substack makes him like $1 million a month or some shit like that. Like Glenn Greenwald makes significantly more money than I do on a monthly basis from his Substack. That's kind of weird since you are the same and Glenn and Taibbi fell off and went right wing. Yeah, I know, but he thinks that that's like truthful because there's agreements there. Okay? He agrees with some of the things that, as an older guy, he agrees with some of the fucking things that Matt Taibbi and Glenn Greenwald say about like wokeness and woke culture. He's never heard me talk about it or criticize it. He's only seen me as the guy who buys a fucking house.
Confronting.
So, first of all, almost everything he said about me there was completely false. They were lies. The amounts of money that he claimed I make on Substack, where I'm not even anymore. I've now moved to locals, but even when I was at Substack, those numbers are completely made up. They're so wildly exaggerated to the point of just being lies. They're in a completely different universe. As well as the fact that Matt Taibbi and I have become right-wing because we obsessed on the culture war, when I almost never talk about the culture war. When's the last time on this show I've ever talked about things like trans issues or abortion or LGBT debates? I just almost never talk about those at all. I actually wrote to Hassan when I heard this clip, when someone sent it to me, detailing his lies. And even though I wrote to him in a place that he and I have communicated before, he just ignored it. Imagine how cowardly you have to be to go on your show constantly and talk about somebody, and when you get caught lying, you write to the person and say, by the way, everything you're saying about me is false. You just ignore it and go back to talking about that person. In talking about Richard Grenell, he claimed that I spoke inaccurately about his role in a much less extreme way than these lies Hassan Piker told about me. And the first thing I did upon getting his email was I ran to Twitter. I urged people to go read Richard Grenell's version of events, disputing what I had said, and then invited him on my show to clear the air. That's what you do if you're a person who has even minimal integrity. What he did, Hassan Piker, was he ignored what I sent him. He didn't correct any of what he said about me there. And then he went back and again said that both Matt Taibbi and I have political views that we've adopted because we are interested in getting rich. Let's look at, this is him saying this again. This is several days after I sent him those corrections.
Straight up. He is like a hard listen. That's how big of a fan I was. Honestly, it's really sad to see him fall from grace like this.
He's talking about Matt Taibbi here, and then he moves to me.
You know, straight up. He is like a hard listen. That's how big of a fan I was. Honestly, it's really sad to see him fall from grace like this, but I think he's caked up, so he's doing all right. You know, good for him. But the thing is, you know, they want to make money wherever they can. I feel like it's like half genuine ideological separation from the rest of the left, which they, I guess, somewhat were a part of. They certainly were a part of it. And when I say they, I mean Glenn Greenwald and Matt Taibbi. And partially because there is some money to be made in that other direction.
Okay, so first of all, just this idea that someone like him is the gatekeeper of who's on the left and who's not. I don't care about these labels. I never have. I've never claimed any label other than civil libertarian or anti-authoritarian. I don't care who's on the left and who's on the right. It doesn't interest me at all. But the fact that somebody like him, who urges his followers to go and support people like Gavin Newsom and Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden, thinks he's the gatekeeper of who's a real leftist and who isn't, is laughable. It's what you do when you actually want to pursue material wealth. There's a very clear way that you do that. Everybody knows the easiest way to get rich in media and politics. It is not by doing what Matt Taibbi and I did. The easiest way to get rich in American politics is to attach yourself to the liberal left wing of the Democratic Party and constantly spout all sorts of claims in opposition to Donald Trump and the conservative movement. Go on air every day and say that Trump is a fascist, that Trump is beholden to Russia, that he's Putin's boyfriend. The way that everybody in media and politics have gotten rich over the last 6 years is by spouting left liberal tripe. So here, for example, is the top Substack performers, the people who make the most money on Substack. And there you see at the top, this is very recent, so it's after I left, the number one earner on Substack by far, by millions of dollars. She makes an estimated $5 million a year. I believe it's more now, based on my knowledge. She's been the richest and highest earner on Substack from the start, is a Boston College history professor named Heather Cox Richardson, who is the living, breathing embodiment of hashtag resistance politics. Every single day, she goes onto this extremely lucrative Substack page and writes an article under the thinnest skies of academic scholarship in which she uses her history credentials to compare Trump to Hitler and Genghis Khan and, every authoritarian, tyrannical despot that has ever existed. She feeds these liberals, these left liberals, this whole narrative about Donald Trump and his movement, and that's all she does. In fact, there was a recent report in Axios that the Biden White House is thinking about integrating the top influencers online who are loyalists to the Democratic Party in the White House, so they can actually work from the White House or have an open channel to the White House. And she's one of the people, the top person, in fact, who they named. She's making millions of dollars a year doing this. There you see number 4, The Bulwark, which is the anti-Trump, never Trump blog. Before Bill Kristol took the Dispatch off of Substack, he was at the number 2 position. The way that people have gotten rich in politics, like the Lincoln Project, like all those people who wrote anti-Trump books, like Hassan Piker, is by declaring yourself a Democratic Party loyalist at the end of the day, sometimes criticizing the Democratic Party along the way just to keep the disgruntled people in line, so that, like AOC and Bernie, you occasionally criticize Democrats, but then tell everybody it's your moral obligation to go and vote for the Democratic Party. That's the people who have gotten richest in politics. If my motivation or Matt Taibbi's motivation were even minimally to obtain material gain, we would have done what they all did, which is go every day on MSNBC or CNN or on our Substack pages or write books about how Trump is the Orange Hitler, how he performs fellatio on Vladimir Putin, on how everyone who's a Trump supporter is that because they're a white supremacist, they want to impose white nationalist dictatorship. The path to wealth in media and politics was never clearer over the last 6 years. But people who are in left liberal politics and media desperately need to believe, this is the lie they tell themselves, that capital, big capital, is their enemy. That there's no money in left liberal politics. Left liberal politics means that you're taking a vow of poverty, and therefore the only reason somebody would be opposed to the Democratic Party, like myself and Matt Taibbi became dissidents to the liberal hegemonic narrative, is because we want to get rich, based on the premise that the only way to get rich is by moving right, because there's no money in left liberal politics. And the person who is saying that about us is the living, breathing embodiment of how the easiest way to become extremely rich in media is by attaching yourself to left liberal politics, calling yourself a socialist, branding around Bernie and AOC. If Cenk Uygur's nephew can make millions and millions of dollars a year, as he's doing, by cheering left liberal politics, that is living proof of how easy it is to get rich in left liberal politics. That's where all the billionaire money is from Pierre Omidyar and George Soros and Bill Gates. That's where all the NGO money is. And that's where the affluent in this country now attach themselves to the Democratic Party. So here you have somebody whose entire existence is a testament to the fact that the way to get rich is to spout left liberal orthodoxy, accusing people like myself and Matt Taibbi, who took a huge risk by standing up and saying, we don't believe any of this narrative and orthodoxy from the Democratic Party and from the left, that Trump is in collusion with Russia, that he is some singular evil. It was incredibly turbulent. Both Matt Taibbi and I always did very well economically when we were perceived to be associated with the left. No one needs to leave left liberal politics to get rich. That's where you get rich. If you're motivated by wealth, that's where you stay. But here's what we have is in left liberal politics, they tell themselves these lies that to be a socialist or a Democrat or a leftist or a liberal means you're basically going to end up impoverished, and yet their most beloved figure in media is himself someone who has gotten extremely rich and whose life is a complete contradiction to the values he claims, just like John Kerry's, just like Robert Reich's, just like David Geppen's. So just to conclude, let me show you one more counterexample, just like Eric Adams, which whether you agree with him or not, at least followed through the logical conclusion of his argument by saying, I think climate change is the gravest problem, therefore I'm going to move to a plant-based diet for my city and for myself. There's at least a consistency there. Here is Jimmy Carter, who obviously is a very polarizing figure when it came to how he was president, but his post-presidency has been a testament, proof of how if you're somebody on the left and somebody who believes in left liberal politics, you can live your life in a way that's consistent with those values. It doesn't mean that he's homeless, but as the Washington Post called it, he became the uncelebrity president. The uncelebrity president, Jimmy Carter, shuns riches, lives modestly in his Georgia hometown, and he's devoted his entire life not to going around giving $750,000 to Goldman Sachs the way Bill and Hillary Clinton did, Barack Obama has done, Tony Blair has done, but instead building houses for poor people. His life is consistent with the values that he claims to believe. There's a consistency and alignment between those. But I hope you can see why there is such an incentive in left liberal politics to tell themselves multiple lies, the two leading ones of which are there's no value to be found in how somebody lives their personal lives. The way you judge people is in every other way. All the performative things they do, the theatrical things they do, the cheap and pointless hashtags they post, the political party to which they pledge allegiance, everything except the thing that actually matters, which are what values are reflected by how you live your life. And then the second lie they tell themselves is that to be in left liberal politics means you're on the margins, that you're a dissident, that you're taking a vow of poverty, when in fact left liberal politics, left liberal media, left liberal culture is the hegemonic force in American political life. If you're somebody motivated by wealth, the way you would pursue that is not by dissenting from left liberal orthodoxies, but by embracing it. The more you embrace it, the more you spout it, the more you advocate it, the richer you become. And there's no better example of that than Cenk Uyghur's nephew. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update. Catch our full shows for free, live weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, and join our locals community at greenwald.locals.com for all of my written journalism, exclusive after-show Q&As, and more.